Welcome back to the program. Of course, this is BottomLine Africa right here on KTN News. Earlier on a Twitter poll, we did ask you, do you believe the East African community, that is E.A.C, has capacity to deal with political instability in East Africa? Do you think the E.A.C has the capacity to deal with political instability in Africa? You know, bearing in mind what is happening in Kenya, the prolonged election period. Burundi is also another example. South Sudan, although they're yet to officially be considered as a member of East Africa, is something that maybe the regional body could have taken care of. So we are asking you your feedback on that. Remember, our Twitter handle is at KTN News. You can as well tweet me at Yusuf Ibra. Our hashtag, as always, is BottomLine Africa. Now, let me go straight to our discussion tonight and reintroduce our guest here. We have Martin Olo, John Gashie, as well as Abel Oyeyo. Good evening, gentlemen, and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, Martin, let me begin with you. First of all, before we, poke holes into this regional bloc and everything, first, do they have any role whatsoever when it comes to political disputes in any member countries?
First of all, we need to agree that one of the reasons behind the East African community is essentially economics, and it's a club that has intentions to grow eventually into maybe a political, into a political institution. But for now, it is still growing towards that end. So what we can say is that I don't think that in its very formation, the East African community was ever intended to take a very strong political role. Remember, there's a whole thing about eventual political federation, but we haven't reached there. And we do not even have the building blocks that can actually lead us there. So it would be premature to even expect them to do anything political, leave alone to try and intervene.
So, Martin, in other words, are you saying they are expected to take action, but E.A.C, as currently they are you saying they lack the capacity?
No, I'm saying that they were never made with issues or political solutions in mind. Rather, they were made, the East African community starts with the economics first and hopefully builds the community and essentially builds some political federation. Yes. But again, if you look at the history of East African community, it was never intended to interfere or to even intervene in individual countries. That's why the concept of sovereignty seems to be played higher. And so country members or member countries or member states tend to want to confine the affairs of the East African community to those of welfare, to those of the community, those of trade, but not necessarily politics.
Now, let me bring Abel into this discussion. And Abel, one might argue, bearing in mind what ECOWAS, another regional bloc in West Africa, has done with, regards to the situation in Gambia, the current situation in Liberia, they seem to be very much active. So can that be expected from the East African community as well?
Yes, thank you so much. Well, the East African community is expected to behave exactly the same way ECOWAS is behaving. Way back in 1967, when E.A.C was formed, the vision was to form a community that is meant to, of course, come into play when member countries have problems, of course, ranging from socio-economic and even political. So I want to disagree with whoever wants to say that political issues were not meant to be solved by the community. Now, ECOWAS was formed way much later, in 1975, and they've been able to grow. The reason as to why we cannot be able to do that, we're actually supposed to do that, but we can't do it because we lack capacity. Now, there's what we call equity. He who comes to equity must come with clean hands. Now, within our community, we don't have enough leaders who can come out and push the kind of agenda that is meant to streamline political issues in member states. So we're expected to do it, but we can't do it because we don't have the capacity in our heads of state, and we don't even have structures.
Yes. And now, let me just bring the point home, and let me engage Gashia for now. And we've seen the situation in Kenya where, the country, of course, participated in the August election, which was later annulled by the Supreme Court. There was another election on October 26th. Of course, we've seen petitions already being filed there. The people who've been calling for dialogue between these two main protagonists, that is Raila Odinga and President Uhuru Kenyatta. From your own perspective, do you think the silence by E.A.C has turned out to become, E.A.C rather, has become too loud?
Thank you, Yusuf. Perhaps to put it in perspective, what we still have is an electoral dispute, and it is within the Supreme Court, within the legally established institutions in this country. As it is now, perhaps we are jumping the gun. And perhaps, as my fellow panelists perhaps observed, is that the East African community, when it was revived in 1996,
yes,
its protocols was more related to economic integration, but it never really allowed, as it were, what would call interference of internal affairs of a sovereign state. And as it is right now, what we have in Kenya is a political contestation. And there are structures within Kenya to address and handle that. And indeed, perhaps for all the three East African countries, none of them would have the political or even the moral, not even the constitutional or legal, shall I say, high moral ground to intervene. Let's look at Uganda. Museveni has been in power for, almost 30 years or even more. Perhaps in Tanzania, that is CCM. And CCM has had its own issues with Chadema, with political issues internally. We have Burundi, we have Rwanda. And in this particular instance, perhaps Kenyans are, in my view, perhaps asking for too much from Eastern, the East African community, because the issue is still internal as of now.
Yes.
And until it has been determined, until it has been resolved within the mechanisms that are inherent of a sovereign state, then they cannot come in, because that would be seen as interfering in internal electoral processes.
Yes, and I think you've delivered your point. Let me now engage Martin once again. And Martin, in March 2013, the then E.A.C chairman, the former Tanzanian President Jakaya Kikwete, this is what he said: democracy, good governance, human rights and rule of law are critical tenets of the East African community. If you don't have that, forget E.A.C. From your own perspective, do you think we have some sort of a real democracy, good governance in the region?
That's a very interesting question, Yusuf. In fact, Gashia touches it, and this is the most important thing that we need to observe, that there are certain variations or there are certain variants of democracy within the East Africa. So that when you are looking at the practice in Rwanda, the idea of democracy there means different things. When you're looking at the practice in Uganda, the idea of democracy is different. I mean, and when you look at Tanzania and you look at Kenya, we seem to be having variants of democracy. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is that when you look at the Constitution, which is supposed to be establishing the political structures and also the political mechanisms or processes, these constitutions are varying from country to country. So when you don't like the term limits, you remove it, or you go to the parliament and you urge that the parliament removes it. And what do you witness? You witness the kind of fiasco that we saw in the Ugandan parliament. When you don't like the term limit, again, you do the Rwanda style. So basically what you're saying is that there are variations and therefore variants of practice which do not necessarily cohere. So when you talk about leadership, talk about governance, talk about democracy, the concept isn't the same, whether you're looking at East Africa per se, or you're looking at the individual members. And to the extent that this concept is not the same, there's no way you can achieve unanimity, and therefore you cannot bring about a common way of looking at things. And that's why you will still find South Sudan will remain where it is, Burundi will be where it is, Rwanda will be where it is, and Kenya will be where it is, and none of these countries or these heads of state have the moral or indeed the interest or indeed the courage to question, because that is not within their purview.
That's interesting. Now, Abel, one of our viewers here, Jacob Munyeke, says, TZ, that is Tanzania, is harsh. Uganda, Museveni is using the police and parliament to gain life presidency status. Kenya is at the lowest with the institutions and hostage. It seems, as Martin has said, no one has a moral ground, to, accuse anyone of doing anything wrong in the East African community. Where will that leave the region?
Exactly, that is the point. That is why earlier on I said when you come to equity, you have to come with clean hands. Now, because no one within the community has clean hands, intervention is a problem. But going to your initial question, are we supposed to intervene as a community? Yes, we're supposed to. That is actually one of the roles of the community when there is a problem, whether it's political, economic, or social, in a member state. E.A.C should be able to come in and help, whether it's mediation, whether it's maybe sometimes military help. That is part of the reason as to why the community was formed. Now, the disintegration of the community way back in 1977 was due to political instability in Uganda, of course, and disagreement based on the different economic setups in Kenya and Tanzania. Now, when you look at the E.A.C formation and the ECOWAS formation, they are not different. But ECOWAS has an established way of intervening in places where there are conflicts. And that is because the members within ECOWAS who have a serious investment in democracy. Look at Ghana, which is a member state of ECOWAS. Look at Liberia. Look at Sierra Leone, all those countries. They've invested so much. They've made advancements in democracy. So they have the moral authority to intervene in places where there are problems. Now, our member states as E.A.C have not made that kind of investment. As my colleagues have observed, Burundi has a problem. Rwanda has a problem. Uganda has a problem. We have our own problems. So we can't help one another. We're just a bunch of confused states who cannot make any kind of serious intervention when we have political issues. So if structures are put in place and we allow democracy to thrive and grow, that is when we can be able to find the impetus to intervene when there is a problem. You cannot expect Museveni to come here and tell us what to do because back in his home, he has problems. You cannot expect Kagame to help us. He scores 99% of the vote when there's an election. And of course, the opposition leaders always get 1%. He extended term limits. You look at Burundi, they have their own problems. Southern Sudan is a war zone. So we don't have the ability to make any kind of meaningful intervention when there is a problem. In fact, we're talking about blind men, and Kenya is the one-eyed man.
I think that's interesting. Now Geshe, I would like to hear your perspective on this. We're trying to compare E.A.C, of course, to other regional blocs, ECOWAS being one of them. I've already mentioned how they came in handy during the Gambia crisis. They're also actually talking to the leaders there in Liberia, even as the Supreme Court has put to a halt the presidential rerun there. So the question is, can E.A.C replicate what ECOWAS is doing in West Africa, and what is stopping them from doing that?
Thank you, Yusuf. Perhaps we needed to go back into history and look at the successes or the reasons as to why ECOWAS is perhaps doing, on the surface, appearing to be doing better than East African Community. Remember that the ECOWAS has had a series. Liberia was, until 10 years ago, a failed state. Sierra Leone, until again 10 years ago, was a failed state. As it were, we have Cote d'Ivoire, and you know what has happened. We have countries in the region, that is Burkina Faso, we have Mauritania, and what have you. But we have a regional superpower policeman called Nigeria. Perhaps you might want to figure out as to whether Nigeria has more interest in a stable part of the region. Yes. Is Nigeria a democracy? It's a struggling one. And perhaps, as my colleague has said, perhaps it has a 1 eye and a half, for lack of a better term in that regard. But when we come to East Africa, perhaps, let's put it this way, within the establishment of the new East African Community in 1996, it was very clear that the key cardinal was the respect of sovereignty of the countries, and that they were to have a consensus, as it were, in economic shared issues of security and what have you. But there was never at any one time that there was an agreement as to which way politically. Now, in the East African context, perhaps we are lacking a bigger brother of Nigeria, so to speak. And perhaps, remember too, in our constitutional dispensation, perhaps the Kenyan constitutional dispensation, as it is still one of the most liberal in Africa, perhaps second to South Africa. The bigger issue in Kenya, as it is now, is there is contestation over the results, over the conduct of the electoral process, but we have not exhausted the internal structures. Now we are at the Supreme Court, and perhaps as everybody is very anxious, we are waiting for the outcome. Can then Uganda or Tanzania or the East African community, on what basis would they be engaged until it has been resolved?
Yes.
Perhaps we are expecting too much that the East African community will come and help us resolve our own internal issues that we have to address over what I would say perhaps, an unsaid issues in this country. And they have to be addressed, and Kenyans cannot, as it were, abdicate their own role and expect the neighbors to address those issues. I think we are all being very dishonest out here in this country. What is the issue? The issue here is whether the electoral process was well conducted. That's one. Two, whether those that claim to have been a president-elect were legally and constitutionally done. That is in the Supreme Court. Now, but then there are other issues underlying this. Is it right then that this country, Kenya, for example, can only have presidents from the larger communities? Those are issues we have to address. And I think we cannot expect Uganda, Tanzania, or Rwanda, or Somalia, or South Sudan to address those issues.
Of course, it might turn out to become a complex issue for them. Now, Matthew, you've already mentioned that EACC has not been designed, to get involved in political dispute. Of course, it is one of the fastest growing regional groups in Africa. We've seen a situation once again where ECOWAS is very much active in West Africa. So the question is, I'd like to play back that question to you once again. Why is EAC, that is the East African community, not active as compared to ECOWAS in West Africa?
Yeah, Yusuf, we must debunk this question.
Yes.
I don't think that the formation of ECOWAS was meant to make political interventions within the region. It is actually a default position that ECOWAS finds itself in. And again, I want to debunk what some of my colleagues are saying there, that these communities are supposed to intervene. No, people do not form regional or economic blocks in order for those blocks to make interventions politically. Absolutely not. The EU never formed because it was seeking to interfere in politics. Absolutely not. So we must be able to come to a point where we say it's actually the case that these bodies are meant to promote regional economic integration, trade and customs, and free movement of goods and labor and so on. So that's the real intention of economic blocks. So East African community is one such. And therefore, we shouldn't be expecting them to be playing a political role. Rather, we should see it in time growing into a political federation. When we get to that point, it means that its own member states will have organized their own base, their own foundations, as to make it amenable, or to make them amenable to a federated system that then governs them. For now, we should be able to appreciate that actually the difference between ECOWAS and East African community is one of maturity, one of various experiences. Remember what my colleague Ashie is saying, that the ECOWAS comes from an instability, comes from lessons learned, and has therefore learned to also quickly form a military arm to make or to threaten intervention. So when Cote d'Ivoire, or just the recent example where elections have been held in Gambia, and one faction wants to threaten not to leave office, ECOWAS immediately brings in a standby intervention and actually uses that threat to enforce the rule of law. So in that respect, what ECOWAS has done is has learned so much over time. East African community broke down in 1977, it just revived the other day. In terms of maturity and in terms of institutional development, it hasn't matured And therefore, if you're expecting them to make any political interventions, I think that's too much to ask of them.
And Abel, I think I'm sure you have a different opinion altogether with Martin's point of view. And we all know elections in Africa. Actually, when elections are disputed, it results to violence. And Kenya's election, of course, has raised concern, not just in the country, but in Uganda, you know, Rwanda and all these neighboring countries. So do you think E.A.C once again should have at least, you know, come out and, you know, made some comment or tried to bring these leaders together? Do you think they could have had any role whatsoever when if at all there was some sort of an ideal situation for them?
Yes, well, once again, when you look at the formation of E.A.C in terms of documentation, you'll find some kind of political commitment. When I talk about intervention, I don't mean forced intervention. For example, maybe by the use of military and all that. Talk about intervention from the standpoint of mediation when there is a problem. Now, the reason as to why it's not happening here is lack of a moral high ground, as Gashia said. Now, none of the member states has a moral high ground to actually point a finger at what's happening here. They cannot help us in any way. Now, are they supposed to do that? Yes. Now, we lack capacity, we lack ability, we don't have that moral high ground to make any kind of intervention. But that is what we need to be working on. If Rwanda, Burundi, Southern Sudan, Uganda had leaders who've embraced, you know, democracy, they could be pointing out mistakes we're committing as Kenyans in the process of elections and telling us how to go about our businesses. But they don't have that kind of democracy in their own country, so they cannot help us. So E.A.C is expected, and rightfully so, to help us solve crises, not just in Kenya. And I couldn't like us to focus on the Kenyan problem, which, of course, as Gashia said, is still within our structures as a country. We have other problems, like in Burundi, recently, Rwanda, where we have a serious issue of extension of presidential term limits. So all those problems require some kind of intervention. Our own president can make a phone call, you know, to the chairman, the current chairman of E.A.C, that is Magufuli, and tell him, hey, we need to find out what's going on in, for example, Uganda. That kind of intervention is needed. Call it mediation. But we don't have that kind of atmosphere of intervention because we lack structures in all these countries. We lack democracy. If you go to Uganda, there are problems.
And Abel, I'd like to hear a reaction on this, but first let me begin with Gashia. There's a message here from the Rwandan ambassador to Kenya. There is Ambassador James Kimonyo of Rwanda who is saying, tell your guest that we are not confused states.
I think the ambassador has indeed the right to his opinion, and I think it's indeed he's representing a sovereign state. So I would say that that he has a right to say so, but perhaps we also indeed have a right to perhaps explore the political architecture, the environment in Eastern Africa, and specifically what is happening within the East African community. And perhaps we have a right to differ with the ambassador on what he believes his country, and I think he has that right. But what we are saying, as my colleagues are saying, is that perhaps it's about time that the East African community did seriously look into its structures as they are, and perhaps address or create structures that would be able to be more flexible and proactive to address political, economic, and all other issues that might affect the integrity, as I said, of East African community.
Yes.
Because a problem in Rwanda, a problem in Burundi, a problem in Tanzania, in Kenya, Uganda, and South Sudan will undoubtedly affect the other countries. Indeed, remember, the East African community is a market that is one of the fastest growing, indeed, with over 150 million people. But if we do not get the political, social, and economic environment and architecture in place, then we run the risk of a problem in either of the countries affecting very directly the other countries in the region.
Well said, Mr. Well said, Gashia. I'm sure the ambassador has heard your comment there. Abel, very quickly as you react to that message from the Rwandan ambassador to Kenya, your final comment with regards to what is happening in Kenya. We've seen petitions being filed at the Supreme Court of Kenya. What should Kenyans expect in the few coming days?
Well, first of all, the ambassador is, of course, entitled to his own opinion, but as Kenyans and as citizens of this African community, we're going to be able to point out mistakes when we see them. I still stand by my words. Rwanda is not a democracy. Uganda is not a democracy. Burundi is not a democracy, and that is a problem. It has to be looked into. That is when we can make progress. The rest of the world is moving forward, and we have to move forward. Now, I expect, of course, the Supreme Court of Kenya to uphold the presidential election, which was held on the 26th of October, based on a number of issues, talk about rationality. In the 25 constituencies where elections were not held, it's not because IBC was not willing to hold elections. It is because the atmosphere was not conducive for elections. And in the August 8th presidential election, the process, of course, was condemned. It's the basis on which the election was nullified. So the letter of the law is what led to the nullification. Yes. So I expect the justice of the Supreme Court to again uphold the law and uphold, of course, the election of 26th of October. The process of withdrawing from a presidential election is very clear. It was not followed by the former Prime Minister, the Right Honorable Raila Odinga, someone I respect very much, I admire so much. So that is the basis on which I expect, of course, the Supreme Court to uphold the election. It's unfortunate he boycotted the election, which, of course, I expected him to participate.
Yes, Abel, I think that will serve as your final comment. Martin, I'd like you to make your final comment with regards to what is happening in Kenya.
First, just to react a little bit about what the ambassador of Rwanda is saying, there is a difference between the rule of law and the rule by law.
Yes.
The rule of law means that once you have a law, you play by it. The rule by law means that if you don't like the law, you change it to suit you. So that should explain what is happening within this region. However, again, I agree with my colleagues that right now we do not have any situation in this country that requires any external intervention. I think we as Kenyans know what our issues are. We are extremely capable of actually analyzing and diagonizing the issues and giving ourselves solutions. I think one thing that we must agree is that where we are at, we need to enhance a conversation, a dialogue that seeks to unite us more than anything else, because as to being divided, we already are divided. So we can continue to divide ourselves, but I don't think that's our choice. Our choice is, let's look at those options, those opportunities that bring us together. And there is no option but to continue asking for the root or check or investigating the root causes of our problems and what we can do to cure them. Constitutions are made for us, and if we do not live by the Constitution, we cannot achieve the kind of stability and peaceful coexistence that we're looking for. So we must continue the conversation, and the dialogue must really continue.
Well said, Martin. Many thanks for your input. Of course, Martin is a political analyst, as well as John Gashia, a regional affairs analyst, as well as Abel Oyeyo, who is an international affairs analyst. Many thanks to all of you for your input. Now, over to our images of the day. They come from the military operation in Barkhane forces, that is in Niger, who are engaged in the fight against terrorism in the Sahel-Sahara Strip. We had a similar story earlier. And the French forces of Operation Barkhane have a range of air assets at their disposal, including fighter jets, refueling aircraft, troops and equipment, transporting planes and UAVs. Actually, take a look at what they normally do in that desert. And before we cross over to our editorial tonight, let's take a look at our Twitter poll tonight, where we did ask you, do you think the E.A.C has capacity to deal with political crisis in East Africa? 13% of you said yes, and 87% of you said no. At Kiama Muturi says, as some presidents are pulling in differently, the HQ is based in a country that does not even know, does not know to belong or move to SADC. Move the HQ to Kigali, that is Rwanda. At Carlos Oyoma says they have proved to be a weak team, can't handle political crisis at all. And Molo Chebe says, no, already the East African community have failed to deliver on their key objective of forming East African state. E.A.C is a busybody. One final one from Clinton Daniel says, E.A.C, I don't know why I keep on referring to it as E.A.C. E.A.C, the East African community, is as bogus as the AU, which is as bogus as the original OAU. Let me not finish that comment. And one final one, Witty Chris says, the power is with the people. Watch Kenya, youths, MPs. Well, that is a comment from Witty Chris. Many thanks for your feedback. You can keep on tweeting and let the conversation continue on Twitter there. And finally, here is the bottom line tonight. Now, using a combination of diplomacy and martial, the Economic Community of West African States, that is ECOWAS, forced long-time Gambian President Yahya Jammeh to cede power earlier this year to challenger Adama Barrow, who won the nation's general election. Now, neighboring Senegal amassed troops and threatened to remove Jammeh even by force. Regional powerhouse Nigeria threatened to help. The presidents of Mauritania and Guinea conducted shuttle diplomacy between Gambia's capital of Banjul and Senegal, where Barrow had fled. Jammeh finally agreed to go into exile on January 20th. Now, only last week, ECOWAS moved in for talks aimed at stabilizing Liberia after the Supreme Court postponed a presidential runoff indefinitely. Now, that can serve as an example on how regional bloc can intervene to ensure peace and stability in member countries. After all, we are our neighbor's keeper, right? Now, in East Africa, and critics argue that member countries have almost remained unfazed by the shrinking space of democracy in the region. Nkurunziza of Burundi has extended his term in office amid widespread reports of human rights abuses. Museveni of Uganda is also trying to use every trick to stay in power, while Rwanda threw away the presidential term limit to allow Kagame stay on. Kenya continues with what is now turning out to be the longest election in the country's history. Now, the question remains, where is E.A.C, that is the East African community? Why the loud silence? And that's the bottom line tonight. Many thanks for watching. My name is Yusuf Ibrahim. Remember, this program, as always, is aired every Monday to Thursday from 10 to 11 p.m. Until tomorrow, same place, same time. Bye-bye, and enjoy the rest of